What up, fragrant nerds? Welcome to another episode of Making Sense Make Sense, the podcast that is all about demystifying the wonderful world of fragrance. As ever, I am Thomas Dunkley and I am your host, you lucky, lucky people. It's my mission to make sense make sense. This is a podcast with top notes of fascinating insight, heart notes of wonderful guests, and beautiful bass notes of light entertainment. It is a delightful composition, if I do say so myself. Now, today's episode is all about PR. Having been a content creator for more years than I'm willing to admit on record, I have worked with many PR professionals in my time. They really are a bridge between brands and the media in all its forms. It's their job to get the message of a brand out into the world, which, in an ever-changing media landscape and a fragrance industry that seems to move at the speed of light, is no mean feat. What's more, fragrance is a really complex message, right? Unlike skincare or hair or fashion, it's not something that someone can see, it's something to be smelled and something to be felt, which isn't easily done. So PR professionals have a really tough role, and I think they're a hugely important cog in the wheel of perfume. So today I'm speaking with Nicola de Burlet, who is an icon in the world of perfume PR. I mean it. Name a luxury fragrance brand, and Nicola has worked with them. She has brands like Chanel, Givenchy, Escentric Molecules, Jean Paul Gaultier, Alaïa, Elie Saab, I could go on, and more, all under her belt. She's an absolute wealth of knowledge, as well as a really engaging speaker. She's also possibly the chicest person I've ever met. Sorry, Nicola, it's just true. We have a great discussion about the power of PR in perfume, covering some of her favourite launches as well as her advice for anyone considering a career in PR. It's a fascinating chat. But before we get to the interview, as always, I am going to do a little shameless self-promotion and plug here, please. You'll notice that I don't have adverts or sponsors for season 1 of this podcast, which means you get a lovely uninterrupted listen. I do, however, have a tipping service if you'd like to support me and the running costs of the podcast. You can do that by going to coffee.com/making sense make sense. That's ko-fi.com/making sense make sense. A huge thank you to all of you who have already supported me. I really, really appreciate it. Okay, that's the boring stuff and the shameless self-promotion out of the way, I promise. Let's dive straight into our chat. This is Making Sense Make Sense with Nicola de Burlet. Today, I'm joined by a legend in the world of perfume PR, Nicola de Burlet. Nicola is the co-director of PR Studio Plus, a communications agency that specializes in the beauty and wellbeing sector. The list of luxury fragrance brands Nicola has worked with is both endless and impressive, including the likes of Chanel, Givenchy, Kenzo, Cartier, Jean Paul Gaultier, Escentric Molecules, BDK Parfums. I could go on and on and on. And I've worked with Nicola a lot over the last decade, and there are a few people more qualified to talk about the power of PR in perfume. So I'm really excited to have her join me on the podcast. Nicola, welcome to Making Sense Make Sense.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honour.
Good. I'm glad to have you here. Now, you've worked in a number of roles in PR, including in-house roles at big luxury brands. You've worked for distributors, and now you have your own agency. But how did you get into PR, and specifically into fragrance PR?
Well, it's funny because I get asked that a lot, and it's back then, all those years ago. So I've worked in PR for over 25 years. And way back in the mists of time when I started, there was no such thing as a degree in PR or a degree in journalism. Well, there's probably a degree in media and journalism, but there wasn't degrees in PR and marketing as there are now. So when I went to university, I studied French and European studies and, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And when I left university, I went off and worked in various offices and just couldn't really find a fit. So I ended up working in events. And back in the 90s, the internet was but a distant sort of, idea. And there were a couple of .coms set up back then. And I went to work for one of those doing events and PR. And that's where I got my first taste of PR in a very kind of soft way. But I loved organising the events and meeting people and talking about brands and that kind of thing. And then when, unfortunately, lots of new baby websites back then didn't work, that was 1998, 1999, And a lot of us lost our jobs. And I moved to Paris. And I got to Paris and I thought, right, I need to get a job. And I could speak French. That was fine, not a problem. I've been bilingual since I was tiny, but I had never worked in an office. And as luck would have it, my first temping job was at Chanel. And I got a job working for the vice president of marketing, doing a MAC cover. So, you never know. When you I always say to people, you just take what's in front of you. You never know where it's going to lead. And I did a maternity cover for the vice president of marketing at Chanel in Paris. And at the end of it, she said to me, "Do you want to stay and, carry on working at the company?" I was like, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, what's your interest?" So I said, "Well, I was working in PR in London before I came to Paris." She was like, "Fine." So I got moved over to the PR department and I stayed there for nearly 10 years. And I was really lucky actually because that was the time when, fragrance brands didn't launch a fragrance every month. If they were going to launch a perfume, it was 3 years in the making. And this was when Jacques Paul was at Chanel, and when you go to the office, the floor where the fragrance creation team are, they're behind a coded entry. It was all, very sort of lovely. And, we launched some amazing, one of the first launches was Coco Mademoiselle. And, to this day, when I smell Coco Mademoiselle, it just takes me back to those times because the whole office smelt of it. Everybody was wearing it. And that was great. So, and that kind of was where perfume PR started for me. I mean, I moved on into makeup and skincare and fashion, but that's where it started. And when I was little, because my mum used to just laugh at me, she said to me, "You're always sticking your nose in things." I would always be sticking my nose in stuff, whatever it was, oh, new car, great, love that smell, stick my nose in that pot of cream, that pint of milk, I just couldn't understand why you just why wouldn't you? Wanted to know what everything smelt like. And it's sort of fragrance has just sort of become my thing, really. And then I moved on to Givenchy and I was there in London for a long time and then moved to Kenneth Green Associates, where that was where I literally ticked off pretty much every single luxury brand in the fragrance market.
Yeah, what a great place to cut your teeth, at Chanel. And do you still carry some
Yeah.
of those lessons that you learned sort of working there in your first role through to your practice
Well, look,
today?
you can see, look, they're still with me. Yeah, completely. I think it was a great school to learn, the power of PR. And if you're going to learn as a baby PR assistant, what better place to learn? Because that is a brand that takes brand guardianship very seriously. They also take their time to get things right. And, it's just, it's the best. It's a tough school, but it's the best school. And you will learn so much about so many things. And at the time, I don't think you really realize how lucky you are because every year we would go to the rose harvest in the south of France. Every year we would go to the jasmine harvest. And, it just becomes sort of second nature sitting in a field with Jacques Paul or François de Nechy or whoever, from the fragrance department, chatting about jasmine and roses and sitting with the world press. It's yeah, you don't realize. And then when the campaigns, I mean the campaigns back then, nowadays fragrance campaigns are a bit of a joke. But back then I was working on the Nicole Kidman campaign for Number 5 with Baz Luhrmann. The dress was in the office, there were pink feathers everywhere. I mean, that kind of thing doesn't happen like that anymore.
No, sounds like heaven. Take me back there. You alluded to it a few moments ago about being sort of very into smelling things as you were younger. Was fragrance specifically something that was important to you when you were growing up?
No, not really. My mum was quite strict and she wouldn't let me wear makeup or perfume or anything like that until I was probably at least 17. But And I know that lots of people talk about this, but she used her perfume was very, very. Your mum's perfume is like a big thing, isn't it? Because they
Mm.
both my parents were diplomats. My dad was a diplomat. My mother worked in the Foreign Office. That's where they met. And we lived all over the world, and they had a lot of entertaining to do. And I think if you've got diplomatic parents, that's probably, that sets you in good stead for PR, actually, because you spend a lot of your time being very diplomatic about everything. Um, and they would entertain a lot, and she would often go, come and say goodnight, and then go off, and she always wore Femme by Rochas. That was her perfume, and I used to keep the bottles because I just
Oh.
used to love, the perfume bottles, and I've still got them, and they're in sort of the boxes with the black lace overlay, empty, but you still get a whiff of it. And I've got. It was funny because she had an old bottle of Givenchy l'Interdit, and I kept it. And then when I got the job at Givenchy, I found this old bottle in the drawer, and I was like, oh my God, how weird! I've had this all this time. So yeah,
Wow. And she had very good taste, I have to say.
yeah, good taste. Yeah.
um, and so I think fragrance is such a complex thing and everyone experiences it so differently. How do you approach trying to communicate what are really quite complex messages to journalists and now influencers?
Hmm. Yeah, it is tricky actually because you've got to think. I always used to say to my teams, you've got to think like a journalist, but that has really changed now. So when you are, everybody wants something different. The brand has got a message that they want to convey, and sometimes that can be very convoluted and also quite oblique in a way. And the press want a catchy headline that they're going to be able to put in their magazine. And then influencers want something different again. And when I started in perfume PR, it was quite difficult bringing the two together because the brand would be very much like, this is how it needs to be. And press releases still can be a little bit over flowery. And some of the really, really luxury brands, the messaging was really quite tricky. So you would have to take that message and then try and translate it into something that became quite hooky and appealing for press. And that was quite tricky because sometimes the brands didn't like it. And I was always the person sitting there going, but in the UK, it's different. In the UK, it's different. Actually, the US PR would always be the same because the UK and the US always tend to be ahead of the rest of the markets. And so we would always be the ones sort of sticking our hands up, going, oh, we need something different, we need more, and challenging the brands to come back with something that we could use because a very flowery message about a milkmaid on a hillside and all this kind of stuff isn't really what is going to sell you um, your brand into a magazine. So it is quite tricky, and you have to distill it down into something. Um, and you've also got to really think about where that consumer is. Are they really going to care about a milkmaid on a mountainside that has inspired the perfumer? Because no, but what might inspire them to buy is, the notes within it, if there's something particularly appealing or whatever. So it's very dry sometimes, the fragrance material, which is a shame. And I think in some ways that alienated a lot of press. And I certainly found back then there were a lot of press who were just like, oh, do you know what, fragrance just isn't my thing. They preferred skincare or makeup because you get a real dopamine hit with makeup. You can swatch it, you can shoot with it, it's great. Skincare's got all these wonderful sort of spa-like qualities, and at the end of the day it's going to make you look younger. Fragrance will do none of those things necessarily, um, and it's very difficult to describe something you can't see. So that was also quite difficult. So you have to inspire a journalist who's a little bit like, oh, do you know what,
And I imagine that involves a degree of sort of agility and flexibility when the message just isn't resonating in the way that was intended.
yeah, yeah. So that's when we used to. There was a time when the noses were very much, behind the scenes. They didn't want to speak, and so you had to sort of coax them out because actually, when it came down to it, some of them were brilliant. some of them weren't, but some of them were brilliant. And, they would really talk about their inspiration and their lives and where they had got inspired by fragrance and where this particular one had, come from, etc. And so we had to then draw on all these different strands. I mean, sometimes it can go a little bit far, but yeah, there were lots of different things that we had to pull on to try and get kind of inches. But also, I mean, it does help when people advertise, which you did a lot back then. So
Yeah. And that's a big change, isn't it? I think in terms of the spend
oh
on
God.
advertising.
Oh yeah, massively. But I mean, it's fascinating because every brand has got its own way of communicating and its own language and its own sort of DNA. Whether you're organising a campaign for Jean Paul versus Chanel versus Jean Paul Gaultier, Isimiaki, every single one have got their own way of expressing themselves, the do's, the don'ts. And the thing is that I've always been able to see very clearly, yes, I know exactly what this brand is, where it's heading. I know exactly what lane it's in. I understand the messaging. I understand their language. It's fascinating, really. And you can see, because you have to know, okay, this title is the one that's going to suit this. I know that this journalist is going to love this fragrance. I know that this brand is going to suit this audience. And I love kind of putting those two things together.
And then the challenge of having to sell that to both parties, I suppose, is part of the fun.
Yeah. And also, then you think that you've absolutely struck a deal. And then if there's a fashion designer involved, they might turn around and go, no, I hate that title. Are you mad? Because you will always have that creative push-pull between fashion and fragrance. And that was one of the things that I think Chanel got right quite early on, because the feeling is that, fragrance is the correlation of fashion. And no, not at all. In many cases, it's the fragrance that's bankrolling the fashion. And you've got to bear in mind that the people that are buying the fragrance are the people that one day might be buying the bags or the clothes, but for now they're going to buy perfume. And I think a lot of fashion companies still haven't quite accepted that. And that's when it can get tricky, because the fashion house will say, but are the people that wear the perfume are doing this and that, and you're like, well, no, they're actually shopping on the high street. And, they're going into these retailers that you probably don't like. But the reality is that's where they are. And they're reading this magazine. So you have to be very kind of diplomatic in that respect to sort of, make them understand that, their consumers are the consumers for the fashion and not necessarily the consumers for the beauty.
Yeah, and I think what Chanel has done that I think few brands have sort of since learned and not copied, but sort of replicated in their own way, was very much as much as they have an aesthetic in their fashion and their clothing, they have a very strong olfactory aesthetic. You can probably smell anything from their back catalogue, whether it's one of the exclusive or, a bottle of Chance. It still smells Chanel, and you can smell it a mile off and know that's a Chanel fragrance.
And, completely.
And that's quite a technical marvel that they've managed to do that. I think one of the first times we met was on a press trip actually to Cartier, to the Cartier HQ in Paris. And I was a bit green at the time. Do you remember that? I was very green and not from a journalism background. And I remember being really nervous because we were interviewing the perfumer Mathilde Laurent, and you were really encouraging in her office, her amazing office. And you were really encouraging, and you told me to ask the difficult question I had in my mind because it would open up a good conversation. And as I was sort of thinking about this today, I wondered how much of your role as a PR professional is about emotional intelligence and reading people.
Oh God, so much of it. I think you have to enjoy, communicating generally with people. And I think also I've always found that it's difficult when you work in luxury PR, that you do find that some people working in that area do think that they are above the brand. And I've seen people be quite dismissive, actually, of guests at events because possibly they weren't working for Vogue or whatever. And I just always think, no, because it's for everyone. And I think that's also something that fragrance has suffered from, is that I think people thought, oh gosh, perfume, it's not for me. I don't understand it. It's closeted away between velvet curtains and, I don't understand it. It's out of my league. And I've always been very much like, no, perfume is for everyone. And, if you're here, you've got a seat at the table, ask the question. And if someone is feeling uncomfortable or, maybe doesn't know many people on the trip or whatever, I always make it my job to make sure that they are part of it. And I will deliberately, go over and sort of pull them in or whatever it is. And that doesn't mean, if they're from the UK, it could be from any market. It doesn't really matter, because you get these big press trips, which can be really quite intimidating, when you've got literally coach loads of press coming from different places and everybody's being shuffled around. And if I remember that day, there was an exhibition, wasn't there, downstairs, because we were in the Fondation Cartier, weren't we? And there was a big exhibition going on downstairs, which was quite off the wall. And then we went, it's quite funny. And then we went up into her office, which was this beautiful kind of glass box, wasn't it? There were a few of us there. And that was kind of right at the beginning of the rise of the perfume influencer. Because there was you, and I remember Dariush had just started, he'd just written his book, and he'd messaged me out of the blue saying, hello, this is me, I'm writing this book. And everyone, that was really the beginning of influencers and people sort of coming to the fore, wanting to focus on fragrance. And yeah, that trip was great.
And it was a really fantastic trip, and I think also a really good example of how brands at that time were starting to look at not necessarily huge reach. They were looking at that kind of micro influence of people who had an engaged audience, because the way we consume content has really changed, significantly after, I would say over the last decade, or even over the last 20 years. And it's moved moving from print to digital to influencer led. How do you keep up, I suppose, in terms of those changes about where the message is going and how people consume content?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest change in my job has been social media. I mean, for us, it was, on a huge scale. It was a revolution, media revolution, because up until then we had set list of press. And within that set list of press, they were the ones that we knew wrote about fragrance, and then there were the ones that didn't really, and we knew everybody. And then all of a sudden, we had influencers were popping up on the front row at fashion shows, and all the old school editors were like, well, hang on a minute, why have I been bumped off the front row? Because there's this 12-year-old on the front. And it started then. And it was a little bit slower to come to beauty, but that was the biggest step change. And that, looking at that, we did a dinner quite early on, actually, when I was at KGA for sort of influencers, because we just thought, gosh, we need to try and work out what's going on here. And everybody was so shy, and they all had hardly any following and all of that. And we just thought, we wanted to, again, show that fragrance is for everyone, and that anyone can smell a fragrance and have an opinion. And we kind of went from there, really. And the messaging again was different there, because these were people. I mean, there was obviously yourself and a few others, but there was really only a handful who really knew about fragrance. The rest, there was a lot of hand holding to be done, and really kind of explain to them, this is how it is, and this is how we talk about perfume, and and be inclusive. And it's great. It was great to be there right at the beginning of that, really, because it just grew and grew and grew.
And it's still changing, isn't it? I mean, now, I've been away for 2 years, and I come back and TikTok is a whole other thing. And I think the way that we're communicating via social media is just so different. TikTok is so immediate. The numbers are different. The reach is different. Have you seen that, especially with TikTok? Has that changed a lot for you?
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. And we're looking for different things now. I mean, if I'd had £10 for every time a trend report would say to me, oh, niche fragrances are going to be the thing. I was like, niche fragrances have been the thing
Yeah.
for years. It's not new, but it's because every time a new social media platform pops up, then everybody feels like they've discovered niche for the first time. And fragrance talk is obviously huge, and I just love it's the rawness that
Mm.
how people speak about the fragrances because everyone's discovering it again, and it's always a new thing. And I think certainly messaging wise, it's every every era has its sort of thing, doesn't it? And I think Roja Dove actually had a really great phrase as to how to describe this, and I can't remember what it was, but it was all something to do with different types of fragrances. But of course, in the 80s, it was all about power shoulders and fragrances that entered the room before you. Then we segued into the 90s, where it was all about the birth of unisex fragrances and CK1 and all of that. And then we kind of got into, you know, unisex fragrances properly. And every era's got a different thing. And I think certainly fragrance talk and the whole TikTok thing has really come out of um, COVID, and the fact that, all the kids on TikTok are now very much wanting to define their personalities by fragrances that are, have big sillage that basically hang around for a long time, that really define them. It's all about longevity. They want perfumes that are going to last and define themselves because they were closeted away for so long. And that was kind of for me where I really started sort of, oh, okay, this is what's happening on TikTok, and this is what they're talking about. And they talk more about the longevity of fragrances than necessarily the story behind the fragrances, as it were. So everyone has their own take on it. So when you have press trips where you've got influencers and press grouped together, everyone's on the same sort of journey together, and it's really interesting because everybody wants something different out of it, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And it's trying to pull out those different messages for those different groups, isn't it? To say, this
Yeah.
group is interested in this kind of element of the fragrance, the longevity, the performance, whereas the journalism side is much more interested in the story and the background, maybe some of the technical stuff.
Sitting down with a nose and talking about it.
Yeah.
And also the way we consume our media has changed. So whereas before we would do these great big long interviews with noses that would run for 3-4 pages in a magazine, nowadays, who's going to sit down and read a 4-page article on a nose? I mean, I'm sorry, but they're just not. So then you've got to come out with different things. And I think sometimes the more traditional brands are not catching up with this. They still want to have their moment. They still want their 4-page article. And the space just ain't there. You're not, it's as much about, the journalism side of things catching up with the zeitgeist of what the audience is actually, because we're just snacking on
Mm.
information.
We see so many fragrance launches now. So I think in 2024 there was about 7,700 launches. Do you think that means that things have just a shorter shelf life now, concept wise? Do we move on to the next thing really quickly?
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, sadly, yes. I thought that the whole point was that we were all supposed to be being more mindful about what we were buying. But the problem is that the merry-go-round of PR and sales and everything else that's wrapped up in it is still always very much about the new. Everybody wants something new, and everybody wants, a fragrance for a particular moment in their life. So coming back to what I was saying earlier is, at Chanel, the new fragrance would be hotly anticipated. Oh my God, what's it going to be? And then it would be a completely new franchise, and it would be brilliant. But, the fast forward several years on from that, and I was working on Jean Paul Gaultier, and then every summer there would be a summer fragrance, and then, there'd be a new launch for this, or there'd be a flanker, or there'd be and that's what fragrances then did. So we were launching a new fragrance every month, or there'd be a body cream, or there'd be some sort of ancillary that would fit into the line because you always needed to keep the conversation going. And I think now people are very much like they want different fragrances for different parts of their life. So someone want a wedding fragrance, and then you want a honeymoon fragrance, and then you want, a fragrance for work and a fragrance for after work. And there's just so that the concept of a fragrance wardrobe, that is, let's be honest, the marketing term. But everybody has one now. That whole loyalty to fragrance is just not a thing. I mean, you might have the fragrance that you're always loyal to, and you'll always come back to your bottle of number 5 or whatever it is. But in the meantime, you'll be having affairs left, right, and centre with different fragrances, and why not?
Yeah, I think perfume promiscuity is probably the only acceptable kind, possibly.
I love that. Yes, why not?
And do you think, because I can think of one brand who in the last 6 months have launched 6 fragrances, different collections, different individual launches. Do you think we might be heading into a bit of a space where there's too much perfume?
Well, it depends through which optic you're looking at it, because obviously from a sales perspective, they'll be like, well, no. But then as consumers, we probably should be being a little bit more mindful about what we are consuming. And if these fragrances are promising greater longevity, then we'll be using less of them. But then if people are turning more to dupes that don't last, then maybe, there is more of a market for it because you need to spray it more. So I don't know, the launches have been going up and up and up. That is true. And, we've only got so much space. So it's a tricky one, that.
It is. And I think you can worry that we're getting to a point of, too much. But actually, for a lot of it, the quality isn't reducing. I mean, some areas you get good and bad, don't you, everywhere. But I still think we're seeing a lot of innovation and a lots of new signatures, I can think of lots of fragrances and lots of brands who are doing something new every time. And you think, wow, it used to be that we'd get, a fragrance of the decade, would be like, Angel was the 90s, CK1 was the 90s. You'd get a couple. But now every year you're getting kind of a fragrance that stands out as entirely new. So it still feels that that's not hampering the innovation or the creativity.
No, not at all. And it's funny, actually, you say that, because when you've been in perfume PR as long as I have, there's always a moment you smell all these perfumes all the time and you go, oh God, yeah, that smells like a Bulgari fragrance that I smelled back in whenever it was. Well, and there's always like something, got some sort of a redolent memory of another thing. But every now and again, maybe about once or twice a year, you will smell something and go, wow, I have never smelled anything like that before. But it is rare, but then I do smell a lot of perfume, as do you. But the innovation is still very much there. And I think also the delivery systems are changing, getting perfume oils now, like solid perfumes, all of this. I personally am not one for like the absolutes. I don't like things to be too strong. But, every now and again, I will suddenly just think, oh, wow, that fragrance is, amazing. Amazing. It's rare, but I do get it.
When it gets the Nicola de Burlet stamp of approval, we know it's a winner.
Oh, well, yeah, sometimes, yeah.
You've worked at, we've talked about you working at Chanel, Givenchy. You've worked at Kenneth Green, obviously the distributor who had loads of fantastic brands. Cartier, Serge Lutens, Jean Paul Gaultier. You've worked on so many big fragrance launches in your career.
Yes.
Are there any that really stick out to you? Maybe because they had a unique message, or were a unique challenge, or just they were really fun to work on?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's funny because there are so many, and I was trying to think about this. And I mean, obviously, the Chanel number 5 one that we did at Chanel with Nicole Kidman and all of that, those campaigns stand out. And then, there's been various faces of fragrances who, when a celebrity is the face of a fragrance. And, I've interviewed many of those over the years. But I mean, I think the first ever Jimmy Choo perfume, when that launched, and that was with Tamara Mellon, that was amazing. And I did that at KGA. And that was really, really amazing. I loved doing that because it was like nothing we'd ever seen, and the bottle was great, and she'd really thought about it, and it was all, inspired by Murano glass. And then I think everybody expected the fragrance to be like a leathery fragrance, because it would reflect the sort of the shoes that she created. But no, it was a gourmand. It was, not my type of perfume at all, but the whole concept was brilliant. And that was amazing. Serge Lutens, so you mentioned Serge Lutens. We went to Morocco, went to Marrakesh to his house to interview him for one of his launches. That was amazing. But then also, not necessarily kind of brand new fragrances, but for example, Jean Paul Gaultier himself did a retrospective of his fashion at the Barbican many, many years ago now. I can't remember when it was, and so at KGA, we obviously looked after the Gaultier fragrances. And so we joined forces with the Barbican and we decided to do a Q&A with Jean Paul and the curator of the exhibition
Wow.
in the cinema at the Barbican. And it was huge. And the thing is that the Barbican, obviously, as you know, is this concrete building. I mean, it's just, and there is literally no mobile phone signal in there at all. And Jean Paul was somewhere getting ready. We were in the cinema. I'd done the intros and everybody was ready, and we were waiting for him, and we were waiting for him, and we were waiting for him, and we couldn't get him on the phone because there was no signal because of the flipping stone everywhere. And it was just getting to the point where, I kept saying to the poor girl that was doing the interview, I just kept going like that, just like, fill the time, let's get some questions from the audience. And I was just thinking, oh my God, where is this guy? What's happened? The whole thing's just going to go wrong. And I was standing at the door with a microphone in my hand going, oh my God, where is he? And then suddenly the doors just like swung open. He ran up to me, grabbed the mic, ran down the stairs, jumped on the stage, and the whole thing was just brilliant. And it all came together. He was signing someone's cast in the lift. And the whole thing got held up. But it's moments like that, or meeting, Mr. Miyake in Tokyo for the launch of the latest Izzy Miyake fragrance, or whatever it is, and you actually meet these people in real life, and you kind of think, God, you're a person, but you're just brilliant. And they never ever, very rarely, disappoint. And it's great. I mean, there are so many. We launched the Azadine Alaïa fragrance at Mr.
Love that.
Alaïa's house in Paris, and his thing was always to have a home cooked meal in his house. That's how he liked to entertain, and that's how he entertained the press. And we had a meal cooked by his chef in his kitchen, which is a big space, to be fair. But we had long tables, or round tables, I can't remember, but there were so many of us crammed into this poor man's kitchen. And we stayed in the house. We were lucky enough to have a little apartment in the house, and we stayed there. And I mean, those kind of things, they are amazing, amazing. And that perfume was great. I mean, it's not
Oh
around
yeah,
anymore, unfortunately.
yeah,
But
absolutely, brilliant fragrance.
yeah. So when press launches go well, they go really well.
And when they don't go so well, you lose Jean Paul Gaultier, but then you find him again, and it's all right.
We found him. And it was only
It's in the
because,
nick of time.
he just can't help himself. He's just absolutely brilliant. So like a
Yeah,
ball of energy, which is kind of what you want, really, because I sat in interviews not that long ago, in fact, where the journalist is desperate for information and the designer just is giving one word answers, and it's just like, oh God, it's toe curling. So then you have to sort of do a little bit of jazz hands and sort of try and get them to speak a bit more, which is quite tricky sometimes.
and that must just be amazing in terms of your career and your legacy. And when you think back on it, in terms of you've managed to meet so many wonderful creative people, but also been there for some really big moments, like the launch of Coco Mademoiselle, the launch of the Alaïa fragrance, which must have been such a fun campaign to work on because it's such a distinct profile. And I remember he had a lot of it was a whole story about his childhood, and the scent was inspired by, I think it was cold water thrown onto hot stone, and really specific. It must be just
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
amazing just to work with that. It must be so fun to do all of
Yeah,
that.
that was very rich actually, because there were loads of codes. That brand is so he was just very happy to talk about, the story, which was a genuine one behind it. And then also, you've got very distinct brand codes. He loves that particular pattern that you see in a lot of his bags and a lot of his outfits, that sort of cut work, laser cut work, and that was replicated on the bottle. So fans of the fashion were very much keen on buying the fragrance, as well as people that wanted to get into the franchise. So that was a perfect storm where everybody wanted it. Um, and that's when it works so, so well. I
Absolutely.
love that
And
launch. I love that fragrance as well.
it's good. It's a shame. I think it's discontinued now, which is a
It
shame. But
is, yeah, it is. Yeah, no, it's sad.
finally, finally, Nicola, what advice would you give to somebody who was looking to get into a PR role in either fragrance or beauty?
Mhm. Really? Uh, I would say, I mean, the PR world is changing. It is changing all the time. And now, so we've obviously got the influencer culture has grown up a lot since when I first started in PR. And now, as PRs, our roles have changed a lot. So you are expected to be all things to all people. There is obviously the side of things where you're still expected to do the traditional side of PR. I refuse to believe that traditional PR is dead. It is not. And you still need that kind of excellence in communication, and being able to, like you said, read people. You also need to be able to read situations quite quickly. Um, you need to enjoy being with people. PR can be a role that, it's not a 9 to 5, because you can end up traveling a lot, um, and the destinations can be very varied. And sometimes that's not for everybody. You've also got to be a problem solver, because if you're on a press trip to a country that you don't know, and one of your guests is ill and they ring you in the night, or something goes wrong, and you know something happens, you need to be able to manage it. You always have backup, of course you do, but being a PR, the buck stops with you, and you have a lot of people that you have to keep happy. So you have to make sure that your guests are happy so that they deliver the content that you want them to, but you've also got to steer them in the right direction. You've also got to make sure that the brand is happy and that you're delivering for them. And then if you're working for an intermediary organization, like an agency or a distributor, for example, then you've also got that particular part of the business to make sure that you're delivering. So you have to be a great writer, because you do a lot of writing, because nowadays journalists just literally don't have the time to fill the amount of space that they have to. So it really helps them if you can write decent copy, and you have to write press releases. You have to understand a little bit more about social media than just, oh, that person's got a good following. Where are their followers? Because if half of them are based in Japan and you're focused on the UK market, they're of no use to you whatsoever. So you need to understand that, and you need to also understand that, what's their audience? Is their audience an audience that's just simply all their influencer mates, or is it actually consumers that are going to go and buy that fragrance, or are they simply bots? So what is that? So you really do need to understand that side of things, and then you also need to understand the magazines and understand those readers, because I'm still amazed when some journalists say to me, I have PRs who are contacting me because they want me to feature, their latest Xbox or whatever it is, or their latest computer game. And I'm like, but you write about beauty, and they're like, yeah, but I don't think they've actually read the magazine to tell me. Yeah, they don't know who they're pitching to, and I just think that is sloppy. It still happens, and I think maybe as content creators you also get the same, where people don't necessarily look at what your content is, and pitch you a fragrance that clearly is not for you, or they might be pitching you something that isn't even fragrance. I don't know, But there is a lot of that scattergun approach. I don't believe in that. I think you've really got to look at what you're doing. You've really got to build that list according to all the different touch points and what you need to achieve and your different stakeholders. So it's not. I know everybody seems to think that PR is, oh, it's all glamorous, it's all champagne and canapes. It's really not. It really is not. And you're there at the beginning of the party and you're there at the end of the party. And you're the one that has to get people in taxis, make sure that they get home safe. It's not about you being front and center. And I was taught that from a very, very young age at Janelle, that basically said, it's not about you. It is definitely not about you as a PR. And still now, even doing this, I'm a little bit like, oh, this is so weird, because normally I'm the one kind of saying, right, you're going to be on Thomas's podcast and this is what he's going to ask you and this is what you need to say. Watch out for that. He doesn't like it if you do this and all that kind of stuff. So it's really funny being the one that's actually being asked the questions.
And I thank you for keeping to, my list of things that I don't like. You've been very good today.
You're rider.
Exactly. I think what amazing advice. I think you have had such a rich and continue to have such a rich career, and I think it's amazing to see how working with those brands has really formed you into this kind of all-encompassing amazing PR professional. And I think I'm sure you are very proud of everything that you do, and I think
it's difficult because when you're in it, you don't really think about it. So it's only when you get asked questions like this, where you then go back over your career and you go, oh, that was amazing. And you don't really think about it. You're just like, right, okay, here we are, we're doing it.
Yeah.
And at the time, God, I should really be savouring this.
Yeah, it's hard to, isn't it? And I think, when you talk about all of the hard work that goes on behind the scenes, it's, yes, has moments of glamour, absolutely, but it is a lot of hard work. And I think the truly the best PR professionals I've worked with are the ones that make it seem effortless in a way, even though it's not. And I think that's something that, always comes across with you. You're very calm, level-headed as you're wrangling us all into taxis when we've had one too many champagnes.
And it's fine, that's always the mark of a good press trip, I always think. But I just think the fragrance industry is amazing. I think there are so many facets to it. And that is one of the things that I think is great about you doing this series of podcasts, is that, I don't think people realize. They just think, well, that's a perfume that's created by a nose. But there are so many other things that go on behind the scenes, from even like that. I was chatting to a guy at the airport because we were on a press trip last week, and I was chatting to a guy at the airport who was on the counter of one of the fragrance brands, on the Amouage counter, as it turns out. And he was brilliant. And I was chatting to him about, a bit what it's like being a consultant. And he was like, God, we get flown all over the world now by brands to be trained on them. And he was just like, I'm so lucky. And I said to him, wow, but you are the one that is making the money for the brands, because you're out here on the counter selling every day. The fact that they're flying you to Oman or wherever, whichever brand it is, because he wasn't just on that brand, he was on loads of brands. And he was getting flown around the world to be trained on these fragrances. And, brands are really investing in their people now, which I think is great. But there are so many jobs in fragrance that people just don't know about.
Yeah. Absolutely. It is not just perfumers. And I think a perfumer is a really obviously integral part of the industry, but it's a very specific skill set, and not everybody has that skill set. And there are so many other wonderful things that you can come and do that are creative and are fun and challenging. And I think you've shown that today when you've talked to us about PR in depth. So I just want to thank you very much for coming on. It's been a lovely conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. It was lovely.
Some really sage advice from Nicola there. I found that to be a really fascinating insight into the world of perfume PR, and I hope you did too. It really seems like a complex balancing act, and one that requires a huge amount of skill and emotional intelligence. So I think bravo to Nicola and to any PR professionals for juggling all of that. If you want to know more about Nicola and her work, you can follow her on Instagram at Silver Style Pages. And for more information on PR Studio Plus, you can follow at the PR Studio UK or go to www.theprstudio.co.uk. I'll put all of that in the show notes for you. Just a reminder that this Saturday, the 17th of May, is Barnes Fragrance Fair in London. There are still some fantastic talks with tickets available. So if you're thinking of going, do head to barnesfragrancefair.com for more details and to snap up some of those remaining tickets. I'll be there and I'll be doing a bit of roving reporting for next week's episode, which will be a bit of a download of all the wonderful goings on. So I hope to see you there. And as always, before we finish off, I'm a big believer that fragrance is an emotional art form. So each week, I ask our guests to share the fragrance they have an emotional connection with. I'll see you next week for our Live from Barnes episode. But until then, you can follow me on Instagram at Making Sense Make Sense. But for now, over to Nicola.
So the fragrance I have an emotional connection to is I would say Jean Paul Gaultier Le Mâle, because it was one of the first fragrances I bought when I was younger. And I felt quite radical because I was wearing a men's fragrance. And weirdly, that was kind of a trend that has sort of followed me most of my life because I love men's fragrances. And I used to wear Egoist by Chanel because I preferred it to Coco Mademoiselle and Chance and all of those. It was just never really my vibe, and I love men's fragrances. And it started with Le Mâle, which was funny because then I ended up doing a couple of bits with Francis Kurgan, who created it, and he was 28 when he created that fragrance, which is just nuts to me.